We're here with Wally Franklin at Wategos Beach in Byron Bay, New South Wales. Wally, it's so lovely to meet you in person. I can't thank you for your time today and all your help and generosity with our projects and everything, and it's really cool to meet you face to face.
It's a great pleasure, Jeff, and it's wonderful to be here with you.
It is so cool. So tell us a bit for people who don't know about you and your work. What is your background? And how did you come to become interested in studying whales and cetaceans in general?
Well, it's a good question. Trish and I became interested in whales in the mid-70s. And what you have to remember, if you're not aware, is that during the 70s there was a massive movement on the planet to raise awareness about what we humans had done to the whales, particularly the species of great whales. And that movement was undertaken by young people who were beginning to look at the Earth as a holistic whole and were beginning to establish organizations to pursue global environmental issues. Now, the concept of thinking about things globally, of course, didn't really coalesce until the early 70s when a conference on the environment was held in Stockholm. It was called the Stockholm Conference. And that, amongst other things, was a conference where the notion of placing a moratorium on commercial whaling was first proposed. Now, what happened after the conference is that the proposal for the moratorium was taken to the International Whaling Commission, which had only been established in the late 40s. And the concept of the Whaling Commission was to manage the sustainable conservation of whales. But the whole International Whaling Commission agenda was written by whaling nations and whaling organizations.
Well, if you look at the name of it,
the
whaling, it's not the International Whale Appreciation Committee, it's the International Whaling Commission. So
it is,
and there still meets the bottom line, right?
Yeah, well, that convention is still in the form, essentially, that in which it was written back in 1947. And basically it is an industrial management document.
Yes.
The aim of it was to, it came about because by the early 20th century, the whalers themselves had begun to realize that their impact on whales was such that if they didn't do something about their own behavior, they wouldn't have a business because they'd kill the essential ingredient that was their business, which is the whales.
Yes. Now, can I ask you just something really quick here? Is it true, according to C. Scott Taylor, in his book, he said that Aristotle Onassis was actually owned this giant whaling factory ship or fleet of them, and that also the Nazis were involved in harvesting whale meat? Is that true? And then his ship was bought by the Japanese and became the Nissan Maru or something like that.
Yeah, well, the Nassus was certainly at one stage involved in the whaling business.
Okay.
No question of that. I'm not aware that Germany was that involved. The main proponents of whaling back at that time were the British,
yes,
the French, Norwegians in particular.
Not the Russians?
And the Russians. They were the final ones I was coming to. And they were the guys who got stuck into the surviving Antarctic whales, who up until the 20th century, those whales had been untouched. For the whole of the 20th century, the 1900s,
yes,
the 1800s to the early 1900s, the whales had been chased and killed by sailing ship whaling.
Yes, and who were they mainly after? Anything they could get?
Well, they were after what they could get, and what they could get was limited by the fact that their method of operation was a sailing ship, and it could only travel at about 10 knots.
Yes.
So all of the big whales, the say, the brooders, the blues, the minkies were outside their reach because those whales could travel faster than that.
Very
So they couldn't touch them.
So who are the slower ones?
The slower ones were the bowhead whales up in the Arctic, the right whales of the North Atlantic and North Pacific, and the humpback whales. Whaling itself didn't begin until about 700 AD. The story of the human relationship between whales and humans, of course, goes right back to the dawn of the history of mankind.
Can you please elaborate on this alone for the next hour?
Yeah. Well, it's a story that I love, and it's a story that Trish and I spent a significant part of our life tracking down, because to come back to your original question, what interested us in whales? Well, when in the mid-70s, our interest was sparked by a particular event, and that was that we were introduced to a piece of work being undertaken by a dear friend of ours. He's still our dearest friend, Mr. Peter Shenston. We call him a legendarian.
The legend of the golden
The
dolphin.
legend of the golden dolphin.
Very interesting.
And actually, I'd known Peter since the late 60s, because in the late 60s and early 70s, I was an executive of one of our national airlines.
Were you? Which
Airline
one?
called
Qantas?
Trans-Australia
Really?
Airlines, which
Okay.
was eventually absorbed by Qantas.
Okay.
And when I left them, I was the national marketing manager.
Did you wear a suit?
Oh, of course.
Did
yeah.
you?
But I had long hair.
You have to send me a
I was
picture.
very Beatle. And I wore colourful ties, and it sort of attracted a lot of attention. But anyway, how I met Peter was that he and his partner Wayne Young ran a market research organisation called Spectrum Marketing.
Yes.
Very interesting organisation. They, for example, one of their important pieces of research led to the It's Time campaign for the Labor election in the early 70s, which was a pivotal moment in Australia's history, a big turning point in our political maturity. And they did some other great work, and they were doing great work for me. I was involved in looking after, in the early part of our relationship, while I was at TA, and looking after holiday travel for TA. I ran the holiday travel division for about 8 years, and they were doing a lot of research for me. And one of the things that led to was that we produced a campaign for a little resort island off Queensland called Great Keppel Island.
Yes.
And the campaign became an incredible hit. The island became famous. I almost got fired because of it, because it was a pretty outrageous campaign, pitched directly at young people who were very much into hedonistic lifestyles. But it was good. It was good work. Anyway, that's how I met Peter.
Yes.
Anyway, in the early 70s, Peter came to me and said that he'd arrived at the view that he needed to shift out of the corporate business world, and he was going to retire to the Blue Mountains and spend time meditating. Anyway, before he moved to the Blue Mountains, he was living in Mossman at Sirius Cove. Now, I'll come back to Sirius Cove at some stage in
That's
this
a very interesting
conversation.
name. Like Sirius
Because
the
Little
Star.
Sirius Cove and Big Sirius Cove, it was named after the flagship of the First Fleet, and that's of quite some significance in terms of the history of whaling, but I'll come back to it.
So the earliest whaling ship was called the Sirius.
No, the flagship of the First Fleet was called the Sirius.
Okay.
I don't know what the earliest whaling ships were. The Basque whaling ships off the coast of Spain and Portugal.
Yes.
The Basques were the first commercial whalers. Anyway, come back to Peter. Peter, during meditation at Sirius Cove in Mossman, had this amazing intuition about dolphins, and that led him to work on the legend of the golden dolphin, which was essentially looking at the history of the relationship between humans and dolphins, particularly in the Greek period.
Yes.
And then he also began to look at the relationship in modern times, and he began to speculate about the future relationship of whales and dolphins. And his method of presenting this legend was in layers of paper, where he did this amazing graphic work that was overlaid. And looking back on it, what I realized was that basically what he was doing was preparing it for presentation in a medium which hadn't yet even developed. And that, of course, was the internet. because he was layering. You know, you'd have a sheet of paper with all this information, then you'd open the paper and it would lead you to another
like
thread.
A hyperlink.
And it was a hyperlink.
Yes.
And he was structuring the whole thing in a hyperlink way, and he still has it in that form. It's quite incredible, and he still hasn't published it. You mentioned Scott Taylor. Scott Taylor actually took a part of Peter's work and evolved it into his work.
Is Peter around here?
Peter lives in the Blue Mountains.
Oh, okay.
Outside of west of Sydney.
Okay.
Anyway, Peter came after he left his marketing business, went to the mountains, had this inspiration, started working on this legend. He came to visit Trish and I in Melbourne, and he presented the legend to us and to our three sons, Mark, Stephen and Paul. They were at that stage probably only very young, probably only 10 or so, 10, 12, 14. But they were as intrigued as we were. And something in that presentation struck a deep, resonant chord in Trish and I, and it just attracted us to whales. Now, what Peter was telling us, of course, is that dolphins are in fact small whales, right? All dolphins are small whales. But as we delved into whales, we were just curious to know more about them. And the thing we began to see immediately was that we began to learn about whaling, and particularly the period of whaling dealing with sailing ships, and which culminated in the late 1800s, and then it moved on to the Antarctic area. We went on the road to actually discover more about whales. It wasn't until, in fact, the late 80s that we did the road trip. And one of the things that we came across was the Natural History Museum in London, which to this day, as far as I know, is the only museum that actually separated whales from fish in the way they presented whales. But one of the most striking things that we saw on the wall of the British National Museum was a statistic line showing the killing of whales, particularly in the early 20th century. And what was interesting about that line was that from 1900, when European whalers went into the Antarctic, and the transformation that occurred in that period of whaling was the introduction of the large diesel or steam-driven cargo ship and the small chaser ships. That was a very devastating model of whaling. And it was the Europeans, particularly the British, who devised the modern factory ship and took them down to Antarctica and set up the whaling stations. And they were killing whales at an unbelievable rate. So from 1900 through to 1914, this line was high of all the whales they were killing in Antarctica. Then from 1914 to 1918, that whale dipped to almost nothing. Now, of course, you know why that dipped, because that was the First World War, when we humans were killing each other. Immediately after the war, because the war had devastated food production in Europe, the whalers went back to business, and from 1918 up till 1939, whaling kills in Antarctica went up again. Incredibly high amounts of whales were being killed.
If soldiers were required to eat what they killed, the food problem wouldn't have been so severe.
Well, I mean, the irony is they didn't use the whales for food in those days.
Yes.
In fact, we've hardly ever used whales for food.
Yes.
I'll come back to what we use them for. But just to finish this story, because it's quite important to understand, this is one of the core motivations for Trish and I in what took us into the whales, which became an interest that turned into a passion and ultimately has become an obsession, which is going to occupy us for the rest of our lives.
And beyond.
Anyway, that line of killing between 1939 and 45, when the Second World War was taking place, the killing went down again because men were concentrating on killing each other. And then after the Second World War in 1939, the whalers started up again, and the most devastating period of Antarctic whaling took place. And as I've already told you, about this time, the whalers began to focus on what they were doing in terms of devastation to the great whales.
Yes.
And that led to the formation of the International Whaling Commission. Now that was the kind of vista that was opening up to us in the late 70s. That's what possessed Trish and made her want to start an organisation to help raise awareness about whales and dolphins. The reason being that what we could see was that very few people in the public in all the great countries knew little about this story. But with those people that I mentioned earlier who were founding these new organisations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, etc., etc., they were the ones who took up the whale issue, and the leading one to take up the whale issue, of course, was Greenpeace. And Greenpeace were brought to the whale issue by a scientist who was studying whales called Dr. Paul Spong, who was studying orca whales, and was fired because he started writing papers about these whales being intelligent. And of course he was studying them in the Vancouver Aquarium.
Yes.
And the aquarium management were terrified that if the public began to think about these whales as having intelligence and being smart,
they'd go like, well, so what are they doing being held captive?
Yeah, exactly. So they fired Paul. And
Now,
Paul's reaction was to go and sit beside the pool with his orca whales and ponder his future and their future. And he'd got to know one of the whales very well. I think the whale's name was Tara. I may be wrong about that. And anyway, while he was sitting at the pool, this whale came rushing up to him and grabbed his leg with its teeth. And in the moment, he so trusted the whale that he didn't react. It was probably good that he didn't, because had he reacted, the whale may well have bitten his leg off.
Yeah.
So he sat and he pondered this moment, and he thought, well, what the hell's going on here? And what he realized was that he was trusting the orca. And it was that realization that the orca was trying to communicate this issue of trust that motivated him to think, well, I've got to do something to help these whales.
Yes.
So he went to Greenpeace, which in those days was an organisation called Don't Make Waves, who at the end of their meetings, they were actually an organisation dedicated to the uranium issue, to the atomic issue.
Really?
And at the end of their meetings, they used to put up their fingers and say, let's have a green peace. So when Paul first went to them, they were still called Don't Make Waves. But the chairman of the group was a media man, Bob, I've forgotten his second name, one of the ships is named after him, but a very, very insightful human being. And he said to Spong, he said, look, he said, if you're going to raise awareness amongst publics around the world, he said, you've got to create these mind bombs.
Yes.
You've got to create something that people can relate to. And he immediately conceived the idea of Greenpeace going out. Well, it led to Greenpeace going out, jumping into their little Zodiacs, confronting the Russian whalers in the North Pacific, and getting that epochal picture of a harpoon being shot over the Zodiac that Paul Watson was actually in, of Sea Shepherd, was in that boat as a young volunteer with Greenpeace. And that was really a core moment in what was known as the whale wars. Whale wars. Now, I said it was that period where awareness was being raised, and this event happened in the late 70s, and that's when awareness about whales was beginning to actually get some traction.
Yes.
And the reason these organisations all adopted the whale issue was there were so many complications in borders and barriers and nationalities and legal systems on land. The whale issue in the oceans, there were none of those issues. The whales were a global issue.
Yes.
And the organisations were able to relate to them. And of course they went for it. And it took 10 years from 72 to 82, because what happened when that moratorium issue was taken to the IWC, the whalers controlled the IWC, and in the early 70s they just killed any discussion of the moratorium.
Yes.
And the way the environmentalists tackled it was that they went out and started talking to small countries who had environmental empathy and sympathies and convinced them all to join the IWC and gradually put together a block of votes, and that block of votes led to the declaration of the moratorium at the IWC in 1982.
Okay.
But ironically, it took another 4 years to actually get it into effect. It didn't come into effect till '86.
Yes. Well, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
All along, from back in the days when whaling started in 700 AD,
Yeah.
and all along, and then through its increasing levels of industrialization and stuff, were there factions or groups of people that sort of knew who they were as fellow sentient beings all along, and so also who did the public think the whales actually were that they needed protecting, you know, and how has that evolved alongside what we're talking about?
Well, the simple answer to your question is no. And that was the thing. Trish and I, when we went off on this sabbatical that I told you about, to meet anybody and anybody involved in whales and to go to all the places where there was information and knowledge about whales, it wasn't until the late 80s. And the core question that Trish had in her mind was, when did humans change their attitude towards whales? And the reality is that she found no one and no reference to any kind of empathetic thinking amongst people, and no public awareness throughout the world about whales. So it wasn't until that whale wars took place between 72 and 82 that finally the issue started to come into public awareness.
What about the ideas of the ancient Greeks of writing about how the dolphins love music and
very interesting
things
question.
like that?
If you look at the history of the human relationship and whales, it falls into probably three periods. The period before the beginning of commercial whaling, the period of commercial whaling which went from 700 AD to the 70s to the 1970s, and the post period, the period we're now in, right? And the period before whaling began was an interesting period, because the relationship between humans and whales there was based upon the fact that people living close to the coast came into contact with whales and dolphins, but essentially they related to whales and dolphins with reverence, awe and respect. And this is well represented in the Greek experience.
Yes.
The Greeks had poetry about the whales. Oppium's famous poem about the bottlenose dolphin that used to watch a beautiful young Greek boy run along the beach nude each morning, and the dolphin fell in love with the physicality of this young man, but of course the relationship could never be consummated, and the dolphin died of a broken heart. In their pottery and art, they revered the dolphins. The beautiful drawings in the Knossos Palace of about 1450 of the spinner dolphins, or of the those beautiful dolphin images that you see in their art. They revered the dolphins in crockery and in pottery, and also the whales and dolphins became part of their religious beliefs. One of the key gods of the Greeks was Apollo. Now, Apollo, the story of Apollo is that he came from out of the sky, landed in the Mediterranean, took the form of a dolphin, and flagged down a group of Cretan businessmen who were on a ship in the Mediterranean and said, "You guys are going to set up a temple outside Athens, and that temple is going to be have an important impact on the commercial, economic and spiritual future of Greece." And of course it was the temples of the dolphin ladies. They were able to answer mysterious questions.
Is this the temple at Delphi?
The Delphi temple. And of course, the word Delphi means womb in Greek.
Does it?
It does, yeah. And it also means friend, okay? Philadelphia, place of friends, you know.
Yes.
Anyway, so the Greek experience was characteristic of our early interaction. Earlier on in history, back as far as about 5,000, the Indians, there was a story the Indians told that Vishnu in a particular form came to the earth in the form of a fish man. He had a fish-like head, and in that form it said he brought information to the Indians as to how to organize their religious ceremonies. And then around about 4000 BC, this fellow called no, I've forgotten his name, will come to me in a minute, but he was a Babylonian fellow, also was a fishman. And it said that he came out of the sea at night and told the Babylonians how to organize, how to live their lives spiritually.
Oh, was this called the Namo?
No, I'll come to the Namo in a minute. No,
Yes.
I've forgotten this fellow's name, it'll come to me in a minute. But you can find reference, if you go back to Babylonians and
Yes.
dolphins, you'll find his name. So there was a lot of interesting relationships.
What sort of
Now, the
semi-aquatic
Namo
beings?
you refer to, of course, is there's one final story I should tell you there that characterises that early period of relationship, and that is the Kwakiutl people of Canada. Have you heard of them?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Kwakiutls have an amazing relationship with orca whales,
Yes.
and there used to be Kwakiutl villages all up the west coast of Canada pre-European arrival, and every village had a whale man, and the whale man would go down to the waterfront if there were a problem in the village that the villagers needed help with. You know, somebody had stolen somebody's girlfriend or somebody's property. The whale man would go down to the waterside, he'd do his ceremonies, and the orcas would arrive and they'd whistle and blow. These days we know it's language, and we know that they speak to each other and that groups have their own dialect. The Kwakiutl people probably didn't know that. But what the Kwakiutl believed is that when they died, they would be likely reincarnated as orca whales. So the whale man, particularly the higher men in the group, were reincarnated as orca whales. So when they were doing the ceremony with the orca whales, they were dealing with their ancestors in their mind.
Okay.
So they had a wonderful relationship. Now that was summarize all of that is that the pre-human relationship was characterized by care, by reverence, and by awe. And you have to remember that when humans first started to establish a presence on the planet, it really wasn't until around about 500,000 years ago. The humans that we are, modern humans, only emerged in Europe about 350,000 years ago. So it was modern humans only emerged in Europe about 350,000 years ago. That is, humans like you and I. And we only began to be present in large numbers along the European coastline, you know, probably about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Now, what you've got to keep in mind, to give perspective to that, is that by contrast, whales and dolphins were evolved from a land mammal that went back into the ocean 50 million years ago. And the recent evidence, archaeological evidence, clearly shows that they were evolved to their present form between 12 and 23 million years ago. That's before humans, being the first humanoid skeletons only go back probably 8 to 12 million years.
What would our ancestors have been like then? Tarsiers?
Well, the early ancestors were very ape-like. They were
Yes.
like standing apes
Yes.
in Africa. The modern human, the modern human, Homo sapiens sapien, was the 350,000 years ago in Europe. So the point I'm making is, by the time humans emerged in Europe in sufficient numbers that they began to notice whales and dolphins were evolved. There were 80 odd species of whales and dolphins. 11 of them were baleen whales, like the humpback whale. The rest were toothed whales, ranging from the sperm down to the smallest dolphins. They were in huge numbers in all oceans of the world. So any humans on the coast would have been exposed, particularly in places like the Mediterranean, or the coasts of Europe, or even the Arctic coast, where you had bowheads and whales. So
could we say that they were the people of the sea?
I believe we can, because the key point, you asked originally the question, what attracted Trish and I to whales and dolphins? Well, the first part of the story is that we learnt about the incredible impact we humans had had upon whales from about 700 AD to the early 70s. It was almost a total obliteration of 50 million years of evolutionary process of a creature who was a mammal like us, who is air breathing like us. They have whiskers on their faces, which is a mammalian characteristic. They breathe air, they give birth to live young, they suckle live young. In every sense of the word, we and whales and dolphins are brothers and sisters from the same evolutionary root. So we truly are. They are the most evolved life form in the oceans. We are, or we believe ourselves to be, the most evolved life form on the planet.
That's a very important point that we should go back to later. We believe ourselves to be. That's central to everything we're talking about.
Well, it is, and that it was that cultural devastation of the whales and dolphins, which was an incredible hook for Trish and I. There was a reason why that was a hook, and the reason was that one of Trish's fundamental interests in life was history, and particularly history of Aboriginal and early cultures.
Yes.
And she went back to school 11 years into our married life. She decided to go back to school, and she went through schooling and got her leaving certificate, and then she decided to go back to university. And the subject she chose two subjects. She chose art and literature, and she chose history. And she ended up majoring in history, and in 1984 was awarded a degree in a Bachelor of Arts and Honours for a study of a group of Aborigines called the Watchabaluk.
Watchabaluk.
The Watchabaluk. They were
Where do they
considered
live?
a nation, and they were in the Wimmera in central Victoria.
Yes. On
And
the coast?
they, like the whales, had been devastated by the arrival of Europeans, almost completely eradicated. And theirs is an interesting story. And shortly we'll be putting the story Trish wrote is called Ebenezer, a New Song.
Yes.
And Ebenezer was a Moravian mission station in the Wimmera. And the story that she uncovered was amazing, because the general view at the time she was doing her study into Indigenous cultures was that Indigenous cultures were being absorbed into the modern European culture of Australia, and they disappear shortly, kind of thing.
Yes.
And what she discovered, she got back into the literature and discovered a people who were alive, who were passionate, who were highly intellectual, had learnt European language, had learnt European politics and administration, and took on the administration, and literally were at the grassroots beginning of the modern Aboriginal movement.
Did she learn their language?
No, she didn't learn their language, but she studied a man called Spitziger, a Moravian missionary, who did learn their language, and we think that influenced him deeply. And what was interesting about Spitziger, he ended up living the whole of his life in the Wimmera, and he died there. And when he died, the local Aboriginal people at the mission station walked to Dimboola, some miles away, to get a coffin and walk that coffin back to bury him.
Huh.
And he's buried at in the area where the mission station used to be. Trish and I visited his grave.
How do you spell his name?
Spitziger. I can't remember how to spell it, but Spitziger.
Okay.
But Trish will be putting that story online soon.
Okay.
So it'll
Very
be
interesting.
a fascinating story. Anyway, she was very conscious of that cultural interaction between a newly arrived group of European people and the Aborigines. And when we uncovered what had happened to the whales, Trish immediately saw that essentially, culturally, it was the same kind of process
Absolutely.
that was going on. And so that was the second hook that that made her realise that she had to do something about it. And she decided that in the late 70s, I've already told you, she decided to establish an organisation. She registered the name, and the name was ORCA, the Oceania Communications and Research Alliance. But as fate would have it, I was coming at the end of my career in the airline industry, which I'd been in for 23 years. She was just ending her history. And then in 1979, an unusual thing occurred in that a young man came into my office when he wanted to meet with me as marketing manager of one of Australia's 2 airlines, and he was asking for help to fund the establishment of a bicentennial project. And the bicentennial project was called the reenactment of the voyage of the First Fleet. Now, the First Fleet was a group of 11 ships which left England in May 1787.
Is that James Cook?
No, it's Arthur Phillips and the fleet.
Yeah,
Arthur
with
Phillip
the
and the
convicts.
And they arrived in Australia on the 26th of January 1788 with about 1,450 souls on
Botany
board.
Bay, right?
And that was the founding of modern European Australia.
Yes.
Okay, and of course the beginning of the onslaught on the indigenous peoples. Now, I grew up in a country town in Western Australia, and when I went to school, I was taught that Australian history was related directly to British history, and at school, my history lesson was to colour a map of the world red for the areas that were under control of the British. I learnt nothing about Australian history.
Well, did you know any Indigenous people when you were growing up?
In my town, hardly. Had no contact with them. There was one young Aboriginal girl at school who I noticed, but I really had no knowledge or understanding. It was like,
they were
you could
invisible
liken
to you.
my attitude to the attitude of the public
Yes.
in the 70s about whales. The public just didn't know.
Yes.
And I didn't know. But when Trish was doing her studies, I became totally absorbed in what she was learning, because here I was relearning Australian history, and I really got into it.
Well, we're talking about the parallels between the indigenous people of the land and the indigenous people of the sea.
Exactly. There is a parallel, and that was what struck Trish, and that was just, if you like, another big lever going, yeah, we've got to get involved with the whales.
Yes.
Anyway, to cut a long story short, the fleet was a bit of an interruption in our lives, because in about 84, when Trish had finished her degree, she was about to begin a master's at Sydney University, in fact to study the Bundjalung people here in the Northern Rivers.
Yes.
And I finished my time with the airline industry. I resigned, and at that moment in time, the young man who'd come to my office, his name was Dr. Jonathan King. He was a descendant of the first officer on HMS Sirius on the fleet, and King was the lieutenant to Arthur Phillips, and he became the 3rd governor of New South Wales. And Jonathan, as his ancestor, came to the notion that he should reenact his ancestors' voyage as a bicentennial event, but the government was totally against it. And I first met him in '79. I watched him for 5 years struggle with the government, and I couldn't believe the degree and depth the government went to destroy him and to destroy his idea. And the idea of the fleet seemed utterly appropriate. The reasons the government were against it was because, first of all, it invoked the genocide we'd conducted upon the Aborigines.
Yes.
Secondly, it overemphasised our paternal relationship with Britain.
Yes.
And thirdly, it emphasised our convict origins, our modern convict origins.
This is history.
This is history. So, my own thinking was that it's true Australian history. It
Absolutely,
should be told.
absolutely.
It should be told.
No, but since when did humanity
Yeah.
ever really want to know the truth
So
about
anyway,
stuff?
sometime in '84, Jonathan King's wife rang Trish and said, "Look, Jonathan's on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The government have almost beaten him to a pulp. He can't see how he's going to get his project up. And Trish, I'm asking you, would you and Wally be prepared to help Jonathan?" And Trish came to me and she said, "Wow," she said, "Jane's asked us this." And Trish said, "Look, you know, it's big. If we take it on, it's big." And we discussed it. We in fact discussed it for several weeks because we knew it was a significant request. And eventually we both decided, Trish decided, because what she said is the reenactment fleet is living history. So she decided to put aside her graduate studies and to concentrate on documenting the reenactment fleet as a historian.
Yes.
And she asked me if I'd be prepared to help with my skills as a businessman. And so we decided to take it on. So we joined into a partnership with Jane and Jonathan. I showed him how to establish a company to value what he'd done in the last 5 years.
Yep.
We pitched it to Hoyts and Edgley and to other big sponsors. Managed to raise, overall we raised $14 million, and over a 5-year period we pulled it off against continued incredible sabotage by the Australian government.
Who was the Prime Minister at that
The
time?
key Prime Minister was Hawke.
Okay.
And it's all in, Jonathan's just written a book called Tall Ships and Tall Stories.
Yep.
And he wrote a previous book called The Battle for the Bicentennial. And the whole story is documented in that. In Tall Ships and Tall Stories, he described me as a dragon slayer because I was the man who stood up against the Australian government and eventually got the whole thing to work.
Did you ever meet Bob Hawke?
Yeah, actually, he a year after the fleet, he had to give me an award.
Did he?
They declared the fleet the joint bicentennial event of the year, along with the Brisbane Expo.
Was he grimacing?
No, he was smart. He was a politician. He
has to go with
he had
whatever.
To do what politicians
Absolutely.
did. But it's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
Now, why is it important to Trish and I and the whales? Okay, that's the question that's running around in your mind at the moment. And it became really important. The reason it became important was that Jonathan, who at the time was studying his ancestor, and eventually he got a PhD on a thesis about his ancestor, Philip Gidley King, what I hadn't realised is that the fleet actually brought commercial whaling to Australia.
Did they?
The 11 ships of the fleet were made up of 9 commercial ships rented by the British government and 2 Navy ships, the Sirius and the Friendship. Now, the 9 ships that were rented were Arctic whalers who'd been sitting around in Britain because they just whaled out the northern Arctic of slow-moving right whales and bowhead whales, and had no whales and wanted to go whaling in the Southern Oceans.
And what year was this?
This was in 1787.
Okay.
The fleet left.
Okay.
So what the British government did is they said, if you give us these 9 ships at a cheap rate, we'll give you lucrative licenses to go whaling in the Southern Oceans. And that's exactly what happened.
And bring the meat
when
back
those
to England?
ships, well, they didn't have it. That's the irony of
They
it.
didn't want the meat.
The meat was not what they were after.
wanted
It was
the
the
oil.
oil.
Yes.
You raised that question earlier.
Yes.
What was it the whalers were after? Well, fundamentally, throughout the whaling ship period, it was the oil.
Yes.
Because there was no refrigeration, there was no
It was
electricity.
before the
They
era of
couldn't preserve.
no hydrocarbons.
What the flesh of the whale was used for was to boil the pots that they used to extract the oil from the bodies of the whales. Pretty macabre kind of thing, but that's what used to happen. It was the baleen and the oil, and the baleen was used it was the pre-petroleum plastic, or all things plastic, piano keys, corsets, coat hangers, all kinds of plastic. There were over 100 commodities that the whales were used for, predominantly these plastic type things and the oil-based products. Now, the oil was predominantly used in the late 1800s to light the streets of all the newly emerging European cities that were springing up in Australia, in North America, because the first fleet arrived in 1788. A year later, the Yankee whalers from Massachusetts came into the Pacific and killed their first sperm whale in the Pacific in 1789. By about 1800, the Yankee whalers were right across the Pacific and down around southern Australia. And in 1803, when King's ancestor, Philip King, became the third governor of New South Wales, the first thing he did was set up a major whaling industry in Australia at Little Serious Cove and Big Serious Cove. Bing!
Where's that?
Peter Shenston,
Yes.
Mossman,
Ah.
right, where Peter had his inside.
Why did they use the name Sirius for the boat and for there?
We could never really find that out. The ship that was called Sirius was originally called the Berwick, and it was a hulk in a river in Britain, and Arthur Phillips, the commander of the fleet, who was an extraordinary character, he had the ship rebuilt and he named it Sirius. It was likely related to Portsmouth, where they left from, because Portsmouth was where the Templars left to go to for the religious killings in Asia, okay? And the pennant of Portsmouth is made up of the crescent moon and the star Sirius.
That's Masonic.
Okay? It's very Masonic. And so Sirius, that's where Sirius probably derived from. But interestingly, the British Navy have always had a HMS Sirius in their fleet ever since. And the Queen, in May 1787, came out on the destroyer HMS Sirius to raise the flag and wish us well on the journey of the fleet.
Do they still have an HMS Sirius now?
They do have a HMS Sirius now, absolutely.
Is it nuclear?
I had no idea. Anyway, when the fleet arrived in Australia on Australia Day, in Sydney, we were met by 10,000 boats on the water and 3 million people lining the shores of Sydney Harbour. It's the biggest public gathering to have ever taken place in Australia, was and still is the biggest public gathering that's ever taken place in Australia.
And this was what year?
Yeah, this was in 1988,
Okay.
our bicentennial year.
All right.
So the fleet, whilst it was a distraction, the knowledge that we gained about whaling in Australia, and Trish, and that was when we decided to go off on a 3-month trip after the fleet. We knew that the completion of the fleet would leave a huge emotional gap in our world, in our lives, because it was such an amazing process to be involved in. And we decided to go off, and what we went off to do was to research this core issue about when did the environmental attitudes towards whales change. And during the course of that trip, we went, for example, to Cape Province,
Yes.
which is where the Mayflower arrived in 1620 from England. And we discovered in the journals of the Mayflower that the Mayflower had been sailed by Arctic sailors because they had the experience of crossing the oceans. And the Pilgrims knew that they had the skills to get them safely to America. And when they arrived in Cape Cod, it was in November, and the humpback whales were at the Stellwagen banks feeding. And the whalers were saying from the Mayflower, look at that whale there, that whale would finance a man and his family for his whole life, that whale alone. So the knowledge of whaling came from Europe to the new America, and the whaling was set up in Massachusetts in the 1620s, and by the 1700s, the Yankee whalers, as they became known, had whaled out the rest of the Atlantic of slow-moving whales, and preceding them, the British, the Dutch and the Basques had whaled out the North Arctic, which led to those Arctic ships sitting in England that became the fleet ships. So whaling came to America with a ship, whaling came to Australia with ship, whale ships traversed the world unfettered, and in the late 1800s, the 1840s, there were 735 Yankee whaling ships, and the rest of the 1,000 ships plying the oceans were European ships, slow-moving ships, chasing the whales, and they were beginning to run out of whales. And at the end of the 1800s, two things happened that brought an end to whaling. the fundamental thing is that the whalers had run out of whales. In the late 1800s, the whaling ships used to gather in Hawaii and rush up into the Arctic because there was a last batch of right whales and bowhead whales up there, and they slaughtered those in about 25 years. And so by the turn of the century, the whaling sailing ships had just run out of whales. Secondly, oil was discovered and gold was discovered, and those two events
took the burden off
attracted
the
labour away from the ships.
Yes.
And as well, the oil industry replaced the products that were formerly produced by whales, which was oil and plastics.
So they started raping the entire earth
So
instead of just
that
one
was
species.
the next phase
Yes.
of the devastation.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Hey,
It all began with your question, Jeff, of what attracted Trish and I to the whales. Well, what I've told you is that the story of whales that unfolded to us was that humans had a good relationship with whales from their early history to about 700 AD.
and some would say that whales even helped us to become people, because they were people long before we were.
Absolutely, absolutely. Who knows what they were doing to us at an unconscious level.
Well, and I'd like to talk about this, and maybe a conscious level on their
Yeah.
part.
Anyway, so the second part was the whaling period from 700 to the 1970s, where humans, as they were advancing around the planet, as the new industrial age was coming on, they were devastating whales, initially with the sailing ship technology, and subsequently in the early 20th century, or the early 20th century with industrialized technology. And by the 1970s, they'd almost wiped out the whales. And then the third element was Trish's interest in the interaction between modern humans and ancient indigenous cultures, and how a very similar process had gone on and was going on.
Absolutely. I create a contrast between, I use the word civilized in quotation marks versus indigenous people. And
Yeah.
civilized, you know, the actual etymological root is Latin, and it means living in cities.
Yeah.
So that's really all that civilized means.
And that describes modern humans.
Absolutely.
Because we lived in cities and we developed devastating power tools.
Absolutely.
And we applied those to the whales until they almost all ran out.
What year
Now-
did Australia make whaling illegal?
It wasn't until 1976 the last whaling station shut down in Australia.
And what year?
Australia had a major meeting in the late 70s. They held an inquiry called the Frost Inquiry, and there's an amazing report which you can find online of that. And of course, that inquiry attracted all those young people I talked about who
Yes.
were waging the whale war.
Yep.
They were all attracted to Australia and put input into that. And Sir Sidney Frost told the Australian government they should stop whaling, they should get out of it as a business, they should go to the IWC, they should promote the moratorium, that they should undertake whale research. And you have to give the Australian government credit. They did do that. They have pursued the conservation issue at the IWC. They finally took Japan to court after 20 years and won in the international court and had the Japanese whaling activity declared illegal. But in spite of that, the Japanese are still intending to go on.
Yes.
But the issue has now been raised to a level where continued pressure can be brought to bear on stopping anybody whaling.
Yes.
Okay?
What year did Australia make it illegal to hunt Aborigines in Tasmania?
I don't know, but it probably
I think it was a
wasn't
year. I think it was the year after they made whaling illegal.
That's probably right.
And how
yeah.
bizarre is that?
Well, look, here we are at this very time discussing the recognition of Indigenous Australia in our what do they call it? The document. Okay, it'll come to me. It's ironic that we're discussing right now Aboriginal rights, because one of the things I learnt when I delved into the history of the fleet is that as the fleet was being prepared in the British Houses of Parliament, the issue was raised of the Aboriginals that occupied the Botany Bay area.
Darkinjung and Gumaroy?
Well, there were a number of politicians who argued that they were there and their presence had to be recognised.
That terra nullius was a fiction.
Well, they argued for that, but ultimately the whole process took a long time, and at the end of it, the order that was written by King George completely ignored the fact that the Aborigines were there. So if you have a true look at history, the issue of the rights of Aboriginal Australians was discussed by Europeans prior to their arrival, and for that reason we've got to recognise their presence here in Australia prior to us.
It's a little late, isn't it?
It is a little late, but better late than never.
Absolutely.
And there's probably Trish and I, one of the questions that the issue of the whales and the Indigenous people, we've often pondered the question, what's going on between these Europeans who seem to have no connectedness to spirit or connectedness to earth, who are terrorising the planet and destroying our habitat. Now the whales have shown us that it's possible to live for 50 million years in empathy and harmony with your planet.
Just like the indigenous people
Just like
of this
the
continent.
indigenous peoples were.
Exactly. They're
Yeah.
they're just two versions of the same
And maybe
thing.
it was a process we had to go through. Maybe somebody up there knew that the numbers were going to escalate rapidly. I mean, the human population has gone from nothing to 7 billion in such a very short time. I do a presentation to marine mammal students at Southern Cross University, and one of the things I showed them is the graph of the human population and the graph of all those whale killing periods I described to you.
Mm-hmm.
And those two, there's an amazing correlation between those two lines.
Is it like Al Gore's carbon dioxide graph?
Well, probably very similar. Probably very similar.
It reaches an asymptotic.
So that brings us back to the point, because you started out by asking us the question, what led Trish and I to become involved with the whales in the way that we have over the last 25 years in Hervey Bay. And really the story I've told you is the genesis of what hooked us. The actual events that led to us going to Hervey Bay were in fact quite mysterious, because we knew nothing of Hervey Bay in 1987. We'd learned a lot about the whales, and when we came back from that trip in 1988, what we planned to do was to produce a 13-part television series which essentially told the story I've just told you.
Yes.
And
Did that get made?
No, it never got made. We ended up going to Hervey Bay instead. But we put the project together. It was starting to move forward. It didn't work properly and things didn't feel right, and Trish and I, one of our basic tenets is the native tenet that invitation is necessary, and if it wasn't working, we figured the invitation wasn't there to complete the process.
I think I can also tell you why, because the work that you moved on to do was more important rather than looking at, I think, that what brought you to there. It's
in retrospect, that may prove to be so.
Yes.
But anyway, we, as a consequence of the thing not working properly, we decided to shut up shop in early 89. By that time, Trish had established the OCEANIA project.
So Trish decided to form the OCEANIA project.
Yeah.
And this was in, what year was this?
88.
Okay.
So, yeah, so as soon as the reenactment fleet was completed in late 88, Trish decided it was time to focus her attention back on the whales. She established the OCEANIA project, although she hadn't quite worked out what to call it in late 88. She knew she wanted the word Oceania in there, and the word Oceania was quite important to both of us, because what we realised was that the Earth is 75% water and 25% earth. So if you were going to call this planet by its primary constituent, you wouldn't call it Earth. That's our bias. We are earthlings, and we live on Earth. but 75 of the planet is ocean, so the proper name for the planet should be Oceania, and the whales and dolphins are the Oceanians. They're the peoples of the sea. But we both live on Oceania,
And
just
many
in
others too.
different realms. Okay, so that was the notion of Oceania. In early '88, when things fell apart with our plan to produce the documentary, we actually were going to pack up and go to Canada and live with Paul Spong for 6 months because we were so interested in what he was doing with the orca whales. And then out of the blue, we got a phone call from a young man who I knew and had worked with 10 years before when he was trying to make a humpback documentary. His name was Ross Isaacs, and he'd heard about our film project, and he was ringing to ask if there was a job for him as a cameraman. And I said, look, unfortunately, Ross, I said, we've decided to pack it up and go away for a few months. I said, anyway, what are you doing these days? He said, well, I'm still trying to make that humpback documentary. And I said, well, how are you doing that? Where are you doing it? He said, I'm going to get the images this time. He said, I'm working in a place called Harvey Bay. And that was the first time Trish and I had heard of Harvey Bay. I said, all right. I said, well, how do you do it? How do you do the filming? And he said, we go up and camp in the northern part of the bay in a place called Wathumba Creek. And each morning we get into a Zodiac and we go out and look for the whales and jump in the water with them and film them. I said, wow. I said, that's fascinating. I said, wouldn't it make sense for you to have a mothership out in the bay that you could work from to do the work? Oh, he said, that'd be fantastic. I said, well, if we could get a ship, I said, would you be prepared to buy some places on it? And he said, yes. As it turned out, Trish and I knew that one of the first fleet ships, a ship called Anna Christina, was in Townsville being refitted, and it was not due to go to New Zealand until the end of November. So we contacted the owner, Hans van der Voren, and said, look, Hans, we think we can put together an opportunity to use Anna Christina in Harvey Bay. If we do all the work and put it together, would you be prepared to split the proceeds 60-40, 60 for you and 40 for us? And Hans said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We'd become good friends, and he respected us and knew that we could do something if we said we'd do it. And that was the origins of our first expedition to Harvey Bay. So in 1989 we did 6 weeks on Anna Christina. We made all the mistakes you could possibly make, but we learned how to go about organising an expedition.
And what was your purpose?
Well, initially our purpose was to, the purpose became clear as a result of that trip, because one of the things that happened during that trip was our first encounter with humpback whales. And we went out on a Zodiac from Anna Christina a couple of days before the trip formally started with the cameraman, Ross Isaacs, who needed to check his equipment. And it was a sort of a grey afternoon, and we came upon a group of active whales, which we now know to be a chasing group or a competitive group. And they came rushing up to the Zodiac and were doing head rises right out of the water beside us, blowing these incredible breaths and leaping out of the water towards us. It was so spectacular that one whale breached out forward and was coming fully out of the water, flying towards us, and the scriptwriter was sitting in the front of the Zodiac. He had a heart attack. He literally had a nervous breakdown because he thought he was watching his death as this whale came towards him, and he ended up leaving the project. Anyway, when we got back to Anna Christina, Trish and I sat and looked at each other, and we asked each other the question, what were you experiencing while that event was going on? And it was an event where fear could have overtaken us. But Trish said to me, she said, the funny thing is, she said, I wasn't afraid. She said, I trusted the whales. You remember how Spong trusted the orca?
Yes, it could have killed him, but it didn't.
And I said, well, I said, that's exactly my experience. I said, I felt that we were in no way of being harmed. And it was that experience which made us realise there was something incredibly special about Harvey Bay. And the question immediately rose in our minds, why are the whales choosing to use Harvey Bay? What's important about it? And that in effect became the focus of the research, and that really moulded the purpose of us being there. It took us another year. The next year we got a permit and put a research proposal up to the Queensland government to do a 10-year study, a photo identification study of the humpback whales, which they approved.
Just to determine which whales
Well,
come there.
we set out to simply study the whales using photo identification, to observe their behaviour and to study them and to get to know them as individuals. Because what Trish found in her historical studies was that she was able to look at the relationship between the humans and Europeans, both in terms of the broader political and economic issues of that time that she was looking at in the Wimmera, but more importantly through the experiences of individuals. And she wrote a lot about an individual Aboriginal called Willie Wimmera, and she tells the story of Willie Wimmera in this story that she'll publish shortly. And anyway, that was the focus of the research, and we also looked at what research had been done on Hervey Bay, because Hervey Bay was declared a national park in '89, and there was a young scientist, Dr. Peter Corcoran, working there. He'd done enough work to establish that the whales use the eastern side of the bay, that they are there from early August through to late November, that they come into the bay from the north and they go out from the bay to the north. But he didn't have enough data to determine whether the bay was important to particular classes of whales, nor enough information to be able to say anything about the behaviour of the whales and why the bay was important to the whales. Nor was he able to say how many whales were coming in. So the two questions we set out to answer, and Trish's thesis summarises her part of the work, which was what is the social and ecological significance of Hervey Bay for humpback whales, and then my question was, what's the abundance of whales and how many whales are coming into Hervey Bay, whether those whales fit with the rest of the Eastern Australian whales, how long are they spending in the bay, and what can we learn about how many there are both within season and between years, and what can we learn about their survival, etc. So my thesis has a rather long title of population dynamics, abundance, reproduction rates, etc., etc. And our two theses, I'm graduating in a month. Trish graduated last May with her PhD, and the two PhDs tell the whole story of the research that we've done. But essentially what Trish reported was that Hervey Bay is an important area for mature females and the younger cohort of whales. In the first part of the season, from mid-July through to mid-August, mature females are the first to come into the bay, who are either resting or newly pregnant, and they're travelling in company with the young cohort of whales from yearlings, that's 1-year-old, through to about 5-year-old, who are just becoming sexually and socially mature.
Could you say it's a women's site?
It is a woman's site, because what Trish was able to measure was that there are 2.9 females to every male. She also found that in the latter part of the season, it's lactating females who are with a new calf, who dominate the second half of the season. They spend 70% of their time alone with their calves, and they have few males with them. Only 10% of the female groups have a calf present, and they spend 70% of their time alone, either resting, nurturing, or training their calves. And they spend on average 2 weeks in the bay. We were able to show that during the 90s and the 2000s, the number of whales in the bay has recovered quite sharply, from about 1,000 or from a few hundred up to probably about 8,000 this year. And we know that the Eastern Australian group was about 1,000 in the early 1990s and is now up to 23,000. And we also showed that about a third of the group come into the bay, and that they come into the bay at a very high rate. There's a 94% probability that any whale you see in Hervey Bay you will see again, and that's very close to the overall survival rate of the group. So putting together what Trish found out about the classes of whales, And what I found out about the numbers and reproduction rates, we're able to say that Hervey Bay appears to be a subgroup of the Eastern Australian whales, and what's happening in Hervey Bay seems to be contributing to them having a very high rate of recovery at this period of time, which will probably start to curve off. But overall, from other work we've done with scientists across the Pacific, we've been able to model the recovery, and presently the humpbacks are back to about halfway where they were before the last period of whaling. When the last period of whaling finished in the early 60s, only about 150 Eastern Australian individuals survived. So all the whales you're seeing at Port Stephens, along the east coast of Australia and in Hervey Bay, have all recovered from that 150 in the early 60s.
That is so cool.
It's taken 50 years to get back to halfway to where they were, but it'll take another 50 years for full recovery. But at the same time, we're now facing new impacts. We're facing habitat degradation in the reef. We're facing entanglement from fishing gear and nets.
There's global systemic threats of
we're facing vessel activity,
seismic exploration, naval sonar.
And also climate change may well impact upon the food production as well as the habitat. I mean, if the reef is destroyed, their fundamental breeding area is destroyed.
Radionuclides from Fukushima, krill harvesting.
Yeah, krill harvesting or climate change could affect the production of krill. That could impact the whales in the longer term. So there's now a period of advocacy. Having done the research, we've learnt some very wonderful things about the humpbacks of Hervey Bay, but we've probably raised 10 times as many questions as we answered. We did answer the fundamental questions.
Well, I've got a big question for you now.
Yeah, go on.
This is the question I've been wanting to ask you all day. Who are they as fellow beings in your mind? What's their inner experience like?
Well,
I know it's speculation.
I know it's speculation. We can only imagine it.
Absolutely.
But you know, the clue.
But you do,
the clue
sure.
for me is their social organisation and their behaviour. And one of the key behaviours of humpback whales is their singing. Now, it's generally believed that only the males sing, but we now know that females and calves also make social sounds, as well as the males, of course. But that singing is probably a key insight into who they are. And their singing is no way different to the singing of Indigenous peoples and the way they used to tell their histories and remember their histories for generations through the songs that they sang and the songs that they passed on to new members of the group into the future.
Describe what a songline means to you.
Well, a songline to me is a reflection of a lifeline, okay? You sing a songline because it tells the story of where you've come from, your past, from your birth, from the birth of every other ancestor, going back to the beginning, to the dawn of time. And a life follows the same form. We are born into this world and we die and leave this world. We have no idea where we came from or no idea where we're going to, but I personally believe there was somewhere that we came from and somewhere we're going to. But the songline is a reflection of the lifeline. You could almost call a songline. And I mentioned to you the work of a man called Darrell Rennie, who wrote what I think is an amazing book on this very topic called Music of the Mind.
Yes.
And if you read and really look at what he's saying, he's arguing the fact that our life is an experience which is integrated into the universal consciousness.
How could it not be?
And how could it not be? And that what remains after we die is what is true, and what is false in our lives dissipates and goes away. It's a very interesting spiritual notion that he puts forward.
Do you know him?
Never met him. He's an extraordinary. He's already passed. If you read the book, it'll tell the story of how he passed, which was quite extraordinary, and how he went about writing this book and why he wrote this book.
Yes.
It's an amazing book. I commend it.
Yes. Let me ask you about. You said you met Dr. John Lilly once.
Yes.
I thought his work was very a critical turning point for creating awareness about our relationship with cetaceans, the mind of the dolphin, and his notion that when he was invited to participate in Project Ozma with the radio astronomers, he was the only biologist, and he reckoned that there's no way we could communicate with beings from another star system if we couldn't even respect and appreciate with fellow beings here.
With a species living beside us.
Absolutely.
Here on Earth. I agree with him entirely. Look, we produced a film called Angels of the Sea, which you can see on our YouTube channel, and what we think about John Lilly is expressed in that film. Lilly said something along the line of that we exist and feel we're above life on the earth, particularly other species, and until we come down from that pedestal and recognize that we are a part of it and we and they exist together on this earth, they being the whales and dolphins, we'll never get it into perspective. And I think that's the process that humankind is going through presently. We're now struggling with the fact that we're about to destroy our own habitat. It's within our capacity to reverse that trend.
It is. But how come we're not? Why
will we?
But this is the exact question. All the stuff is being done by people, but when you talk to everybody else thinks that they're not doing it themselves. I think if everybody changed how we live a little bit, rather than thinking that some nebulous day is going to do it.
I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for several reasons. One reason is that we have managed to change our attitude to whales and dolphins. There's a good probability that while ever we exist, whales and dolphins will continue to exist into the future. I doubt we'll ever go back hunting them. I pray that one day the Japanese will find a reason not to go hunting them. There are a lot of reasons why the Japanese are hanging in there, and we've expressed that on our, we have a website called songlines.org.au, and in that Trish and I have told the story of what we think about the Japanese issue. We don't judge the Japanese. We've always tried to work with Japanese people. There's an environmental organization in Japan called iSearch, which was inspired by a young Japanese woman who came with us on one of our trips in the early 70s. She's in that film called Angels of the Sea, I think from memory, and she went back and established an amazing little environmental organization called iSearch, which is still functioning in Japan. There's a lot of wonderful people in Japan working for the environment, and politics and economics will soon dissipate to the level that sense will exist in terms of that issue in Japan. The other thing that makes me optimistic is the ability of young people to adapt so rapidly. I'm seeing it in terms of the solar revolution. You know, governments and industry are so stuck in the past with the electrical grid and coal production, they can't see that the alternative has been there in front of us for many, many years, and people are adapting to solar in spite of the government, in spite of the coal manufacturers. You know, there's almost as much solar production in Queensland from houses now as there is of production of electricity from the grid. If we were to cover every roof in this country with solar panels, we'd probably eradicate the majority of the grid. And battery technology is now becoming available where we can place batteries, efficient, compact-sized batteries, strategically throughout a community and grab those little bits of solar energy and distribute them within little local areas.
Yes.
And cover our electricity production.
Well,
that immediately would remove one of the major contributors to our habitat destruction.
Isn't most of Australia's coal exported?
It is exported, and you know, I can understand why, but what I'm saying is I think that coal will get knocked in the head by people taking sensible decisions for themselves and not waiting for industry and government.
No.
Industry and government will will eventually come along as they do.
Only when it's more profitable for them.
Well, that's probably right. but they will change in due course.
Well, may
So
I ask
I'm
you,
optimistic.
let me ask you something about there's a species of very small dolphin that occurs only on the west coast of the North Island of the New Zealand called the Maui's dolphin.
Yes.
And they believe there's only about 50 of them left on the planet, a whole unique subspecies. And they're on the verge of going extinct right in front of our very eyes because
Yes.
the fishing industry there keeps trapping them in their nets and stuff. And the New
Yes.
Zealand government won't do anything to inhibit the fishing industry, yet people keep trying to sign these
Yeah.
positions
But
and ask the government to
As
do
I'm-
it.
As I'm aware of it, there are local people who are tackling that issue. I mean, there are still other species of whales and dolphins that are still on the verge. The
Vaquita?
Yeah, well, that's one, and then there's the Chinese river dolphin.
Is that not already gone to Yancey?
I think there are still some existing, but they're very close. You know, the Amazon river dolphin is severely threatened, and that's an amazing creature. You know, I think that we can manage the protection of those species, and that's what we have to be focusing on now. You know, dealing with the areas where there is a danger of extinction and doing what we can to stop it, as far as whales and dolphins are concerned. And I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a global movement to recognise that whales and dolphins may have or ought to have equal rights to existence that we consider we have rights to. You know, the movement to give whales and dolphins rights. Now, we can't speak their language. To that extent, I agree with Lily. We should be concentrating on speaking their language. But if we look at their behaviour and we look at what they've done, they've never hurt us or hurt their environment that we're aware of. They've managed to coexist with their environment. They've managed to form social organisations that are conducive to the survival of their young and to the group as a whole.
They're tolerant of us.
They're tolerant of us. They don't appear to hold a grudge for what we've done to them. You know, there's lots we can learn just by thinking about them and looking at who they are and how they've existed with the planet. And they provide us a vision to aspire to in terms of how we should be relating to the planet. And I believe with modern media that you'll be using to get this out, right, through the internet, the capacity for any individual to actually share their ideas, share their passion. You know, we've had lots of people come out with us on the expedition and been inspired. And their first instinct is to say, I want to join the Oceania project. How can I get involved? What can I do? And our tendency is not to say, come and join us. Our tendency is to say to them, well, what do you want to do? And one girl came from Europe and she said, I want to really help the whales and dolphins. I said, well, why don't you go back to Norway and start an organisation to raise an awareness? Well, she did. She did it, and she's still working, and she's got a major organisation happening. We had a young woman in Hervey Bay, who you'll probably meet next week, Vicky Neville. She came to us in 2005 when the Japanese announced they were going to put humpbacks back on the killing list. She said, we've got to do something for the whales, we've got to do something for the whales. I said, well, Vicky, or Trish and I looked at them both and said, well, what do you think should be done? And she said, we should have a national day of action. She said, can you guys do something about that? I said, well, why don't you do something about it, Vicky? So we introduced the International Fund for Animal Welfare, IFOR,
Yes.
with whom we were working at the time. And together in partnership with Vicky, IFOR and ourselves, the National Day of Action for the Whales became a reality. Trish began providing histories of individual whales and identification of individual whales through her flukes. And over a period of about 5 years, about 72 Eastern Australian communities adopted an individual whale and organised celebrations every year to celebrate the return of their whale and the whales as a whole. Now, if you have a look at the BBC today, you have a look at our website, SoundNet. Today I posted the story. Yesterday, Hervey Bay had a paddle out for the whales. It got 50 seconds on the BBC.
That's good.
And at the end of the track, you'll hear a whale song recorded by Mark.
Really?
So the whales got into the grab as well.
That is so awesome.
Okay. Now, Vicky Neville was interviewed in that interview today. She did what she said she wanted to do. She had to have help, but she got the help and got it done. So we should be inspiring young people
Yes.
to begin their own organisations, and many of them are. I see them all the time around the world, and that's another fundamental reason that Trish and I are both optimistic about the future.
You made me think of Theodore Roszak's expression, think globally, act locally.
Exactly, absolutely.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that I think of the whales and dolphins not only as the ultimate indigenous people, but a true extraterrestrial intelligence. And like John Lilly made the point that the word terrestrial, it can mean, extraterrestrial doesn't have to mean that it lives off the earth, it just means that they live off the land.
Well, terrestrial again is a blindness we have in the way we see the planet, is that we always see it from an Earth point of view. It was very interesting when Trish was trying to name the organisation. I told you that she wanted to put the word Oceania in there, and I've explained why she really believed that. And when we put that first trip to Harvey Bay together in '89, I said, well, look, we've got to promote this. I said, what do you want to call your organisation? She said, I don't know. She said, I want Oceania. And I said, well, why don't you call it the Oceania Foundation?
Yes.
So we did for that first year. But at the end of the year, she said, I'm not really happy with that name. And I thought about it, and I thought she's right. Foundation is a terrestrial name.
It is.
Okay? And just at that moment in time, she received a letter from a young woman who'd been out with us and was inspired by us. And the young woman in the letter said to Trish, and how are things going with your Oceania project? And Trish said, that's it.
That's it.
That's it. The Oceania project, because we can have many projects, we can stimulate many projects, and project is about the planet, not about the Earth.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was how it all began.
Well, Wally Franklin, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with me. We'll continue this at some future time.
All right, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
I saw Chris Clark do a presentation in New Zealand some years back, because the question was, are there whale songlines? This is a story about blue whales. Chris got access to the American Navy hydrophone system that spans the North Atlantic.
Yes.
Okay. And,
listening for the evil enemy.
Yeah, that's what it was originally intended for. But he got access for it to listen to whales.
Yes. What year was that?
This, I think, was in the 60s
So
and 70s.
before the War on Terror.
Yeah, it would have been. Anyway, he heard two blue whales. One was located up in the north east corner of the Atlantic, and the other one was located down in the southwest corner of the Atlantic. So they were on either side of the Atlantic.
Many thousands
and they
of kilometers.
called. One would call and the other would respond.
Really? What was the time delay for the
Well, not too long, I don't think. But after a period of time, they'd move towards each other, and then one would call and the other would call. And gradually he tracked them using this acoustic system across, coming down into the central Atlantic, and they met in the center and spent a bit of time together and then separated.
So did they predetermine that point?
They were probably moving towards each other acoustically, and that's how they came together.
Does he have the coordinates of that meeting point?
He probably does.
It would be very interesting to see what other.
But the point
might be.
His point of the story was that these days it's probably not likely that they'd be able to hear over the same range because of ocean noise that's come along from
many things.
construction and gas platforms and that kind of thing. So
hydrocarbon burning
yeah, he
vehicles.
felt that the sound window for the whales had narrowed considerably, and they could only hear over relatively short distances.
And this was even back then.
Yeah, this was this was back then. Yeah.
Are you still in touch with him now?
I haven't been in touch with him for a while, but his one of our friends, Dr. Peter Corcoran, used to be a part of his group.
Yes.
And he's now working with NOAA in the Massachusetts area.
Yes.
On large whales.
If the whales could talk to us in English for 30 seconds, what would they say? You know what, we reckon that it's like, I think that they've got vast amounts of cosmic wisdom and knowledge far beyond us, but we reckoned that they'd say, well, look, you need to learn how to live simply so that others may simply live. That we have to get over that.
Well, if that's the message we hear from them, that's exactly the kind of message we need to absorb.
It is, isn't it?
But I think they've given us their message by their behaviour, and their behaviour is that they've existed in their present form for 23 million years and haven't destroyed their environment and haven't destroyed each other.
And they're still nice to us.
And they're still prepared to interact with us in spite of what we've done to them.
Wally, that is so cool. Thank you so much.